Chapter 1. The Man Who Should Be Dead. A relentless wind howled through the empty streets of London, rattling the window panes of 221B Baker Street. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon the walls. Dr. Watson sat in his chair, lost in thought, the pages of his medical journal blurred by fatigue. Holmes, in his usual repose, lounged in his chair with his steepled fingers pressed to his lips, his sharp eyes half-lidded yet unmistakably aware. Then, a sudden, frantic knocking at the door. Watson sat upright, startled. Few visitors came at this hour unless bearing tidings of urgency or tragedy. Holmes, without moving a muscle, murmured, "A man, Watson." Middle-aged, I would wager, and desperate. The knocking grew more insistent. Watson hurried to the door, drawing it open to reveal a dishevelled figure, breathless and wide-eyed, his clothing damp from the evening rain. "Doctor? Watson? Mr. Holmes? You must help me, please." His voice was hoarse, trembling with barely restrained terror. Holmes straightened in his chair, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Come in, sir," he said evenly, "and tell us, who is it that hunts you tonight?" The man stumbled inside, his breathing ragged. He was of respectable bearing, his fine woolen coat torn at the sleeve, the brass buttons dulled by grime. His hair, once neatly combed, now clung to his damp forehead in wild disarray. Watson guided him to a chair, noting the tremor in his hands, the rapid rise and fall of his chest. This was not merely a man in distress. This was a man on the edge of madness. Holmes regarded him coolly. "Your name?" "Gerald Eddington," the man gasped, rubbing at his temples. "You must believe me. You must." Holmes inclined his head. "That remains to be seen. But first, I must understand what it is I am to believe." Eddington's gaze flickered between them, wild with desperation. He swallowed hard, then leaned forward. I was shot," he whispered, "at point-blank range." Watson stiffened. Holmes's eyes darkened with curiosity. "And yet," Holmes said, his voice dangerously soft, "you sit before us, very much alive." Eddington exhaled, his fingers clutching at the fabric of his coat as though seeking reassurance in its solidity. "It was last night," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had just left my club on Hanover Street when a man stepped from the shadows. I barely had time to register his face before he pulled a pistol and fired." Watson, despite himself, shuddered. He had seen too many men perish in war to take such claims lightly. "I felt it," Eddington continued. "The impact, the force of the bullet. It struck me squarely in the chest. I remember staggering back, falling. And then, nothing." Holmes had not taken his eyes off the man. "And yet, here you are. Quite unharmed, it seems." Eddington's fingers clutched at the lapels of his coat, his expression one of genuine terror. "I awoke minutes later, lying in the alley. My coat was torn, my shirt bloodied. But my body—" He drew a shaking breath. There was no wound, no pain, no mark, nothing. A silence settled between them. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. Holmes finally spoke, his voice laced with something Watson recognized as intrigue. "And the man who shot you?" Eddington swallowed. "Gone," as if he had never been there at all. Watson, ever the man of science, could not suppress his skepticism. "Perhaps you misremember the events. Shock can cloud the mind." "I was not alone," Eddington interrupted. "There were witnesses." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." "A man in the alley, a bartender from the club. He saw me collapse, unmoving. He swears I was dead." Watson frowned, shaking his head. "A man may appear dead without truly being so. Did he examine you?" "No," Eddington admitted. "But there was another witness. My attacker." Holmes's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You have spoken to him?" "He was caught fleeing the scene," Eddington murmured. "The police questioned him. He swore swore that he saw me die. A silence fell upon the room once more. Even Watson, despite his logical mind, felt a cold unease curl in his stomach. Holmes exhaled softly. "A most singular puzzle," he murmured. He stood, crossing the room to where Eddington's coat hung over the chair. With deft fingers, he lifted it to the lamplight, his gaze sweeping over the torn fabric. A moment passed, then another. Watson watched as Holmes's expression hardened. Watson stepped forward. "What is it?" Holmes lowered the coat, his face a mask of calculation. "Mr. Eddington," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "you have just presented me with an absolute impossibility." Eddington swallowed, his fingers tightening into fists. Then you believe me?" Holmes met his gaze, and in the dim glow of the gaslight, his eyes were like steel. "I believe," he said slowly, "that someone is lying." Watson felt an eerie chill creep down his spine. Holmes turned to the fire, his sharp features caught in flickering light, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Watson," he murmured, "fetch your coat." Watson frowned. "Where are we going?" Holmes's lips curled in the faintest of smiles. "To the scene of the crime, my dear fellow. Where else?" The storm raged on outside, but within 221B Baker Street, the true storm had only just begun. The narrow confines of the Scotland Yard interrogation chamber smelled of damp stone and stale tobacco. The man seated before us, Thomas Finch, a known swindler and petty criminal, shifted uneasily, his rough hands clenching and unclenching atop the scarred wooden table. Inspector Lestrade stood by the door, arms crossed, his expression cold. "Tell them what you told me," he instructed. Finch licked his lips. He was a man accustomed to deception, but his bloodshot eyes betrayed a lingering horror. "I swear it," he rasped. "I put a bullet in his heart. I saw him fall. I swear on my own life. He was dead." Holmes, standing with hands behind his back, regarded Finch with that peculiar, unwavering gaze of his. "And yet, here Mr. Eddington sits before us, quite unharmed. Either you are lying, or reality itself has unraveled before your eyes." Finch swallowed hard. "I ain't mad," he muttered. "I know what I saw. He dropped stiff as a corpse. Then I ran. He hesitated as if struggling against some inner terror. "I turned back, just once, and I saw him." "Saw whom?" Watson prompted. Finch's fingers curled into fists. "Him," he whispered. "Eddington, standing up, looking right at me." He shuddered, and smiling. A long silence followed. Even Lestrade, for all his skepticism, shifted uncomfortably. Holmes exhaled softly. "Fascinating," he murmured. "And you are quite certain you fired upon him?" "Certain as the gallows," Finch said grimly. Holmes tapped his fingers together, his gaze distant. "Then it is not you who is mad, Mr. Finch," he said. "It is this case." Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He plucked Eddington's coat from its resting place and held it beneath the gaslight. His keen eyes moved over every thread, every seam, searching for the impossible. Watson stood nearby, arms crossed, his mind still wrestling with the absurdity of Finch's words. "There is a logical explanation," he muttered. "There must be." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he reached into his drawer, withdrawing a magnifying lens. With slow precision, he traced the fabric along the chest, the place where Eddington had claimed the bullet struck. Then he paused. Watson leaned in. "Holmes?" "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Most curious indeed." Watson stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The fabric was torn, blood-stained, yet there was no bullet hole. "But that is impossible," Watson said, shaking his head. "A gunshot at point-blank range would leave an entry wound. At the very least, it would pierce the cloth." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, ever so carefully, he turned the coat inside out. The blood had seeped through. And yet, the inner lining, Holmes said softly, his voice edged with quiet reverence. Not a single tear. Watson's breath caught. Then where, he whispered, did the bullet go? Holmes laid the coat aside. His expression was unreadable. That, my dear Watson, is the question upon which this entire case hinges. Eddington sat stiffly in the armchair, his hands clasped in his lap. He had grown pale during the course of the evening, the weight of his own impossible survival pressing upon him like a phantom's grasp. Watson approached with a steady hand. "Permit me," he said. "If what you claim is true, then you will not object to an examination." Eddington nodded once. "I have nothing to hide, Doctor." Watson bent over him, his fingers working methodically over his chest, his ribs. He pressed lightly against the fabric of the shirt, feeling for any bruising, any swelling that might indicate internal trauma. There was nothing, not so much as a single mark. Watson's brow furrowed deeper. "Mr. Eddington, you say you felt the impact?" "Yes," Eddington whispered. "It was like a hammer striking my ribs." "And pain?" "For an instant," Eddington said. "Then, nothing." Watson exhaled, stepping back. "I can find no evidence of injury." Eddington swallowed, his fingers tightening over his knees. "Then how do you explain it?" Watson glanced at Holmes. His friend was silent, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. "I do not yet have an answer," Watson admitted. "But I do know this. Had you truly been shot, there would be no mystery at all." The air in 221B had grown heavier, weighted by the questions that should not exist. The fire burned low, casting long shadows against the walls. Holmes rose to his feet, pacing slowly, his sharp mind assembling the puzzle in silence. Watson had seen this before, the great machine of Holmes' intellect in motion, sifting through the improbable to reach the inevitable. At last, he stopped. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are only two possibilities before us." Watson folded his arms. "Go on." "Either our senses deceive us," Holmes said, "or someone has woven a most brilliant illusion." Eddington paled. "You think I am lying?" Holmes turned to him. His gaze was not accusing, nor was it kind. It was simply measuring. "I think," he said, "that the facts do not yet align." Watson frowned. "Holmes, do you suspect some trickery?" Holmes said nothing. Instead, he reached for his coat. "Where are you going?" Watson asked. Holmes buttoned the lapels with careful precision. "To the alley where you were killed, Mr. Eddington." Eddington blinked. "Now?" "Do the dead keep time?" Holmes replied. Watson sighed, reaching for his own coat. "And what do you expect to find?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "The truth, my dear Watson," he murmured, "and perhaps something more." And with that, they stepped out into the night, into the heart of the impossible mystery. Chapter 2: The Illusion of Death. The thick London fog curled through the narrow alley behind the Gentleman's Club, swallowing the gaslight glow and muffling the distant sounds of carriages rattling over cobblestones. It was the kind of night where shadows stretched unnaturally long, and a man could vanish with the turn of a corner, lost to the city's ever-hungry gloom. Holmes strode ahead with unerring confidence, his coat swirling behind him, while Watson followed, his medical bag tucked beneath one arm. The air was damp with the scent of rain and smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a low, mournful sound. Watson exhaled, his breath a pale ghost in the cold air. "This is where it happened?" he asked, his voice subdued by the eerie stillness of the place. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he cast his sharp gaze over the ground, the walls, the scattered debris that told a story few men would think to read. Finally, he nodded. "Eddington fell here," he murmured, pointing to a dark stain on the cobblestones, barely visible against the slick wetness of the street. "And yet, my dear Watson," he rose again. Watson suppressed a shiver. There was something deeply unsettling about standing at the very spot where a man had seemingly died and returned to life. Holmes crouched, running a gloved hand over the damp ground. Lestrade has kept the scene undisturbed, he noted. For once, he has done something useful. Watson did not smile. His eyes were drawn to the dark patch Holmes had indicated. Blood. It should have been nothing more than proof of a mortal wound. And yet, its supposed owner walked the streets unscathed. Watson shook his head. "It makes no sense," he muttered. "If Eddington was shot, the bullet should have left its mark, not only upon him, but upon this very alley." Holmes stood, dusting off his knees. His gaze flicked to Watson, and for a fleeting moment there was something in his eyes, not doubt, but calculation. "Then tell me, Watson," he said softly, "if this blood does not belong to Eddington, whose is it?" Watson knelt, his fingers hovering over the dark stain upon the cobblestones. Years of medical practice had made him accustomed to the sight of blood, yet this was different. He dipped his fingers into the dampness, rubbing them together thoughtfully. "Still fresh," he murmured, "perhaps a day old at most." Holmes nodded. "Which matches the timeline of Eddington's alleged demise. And yet, as we have established, the man has no wound." Watson frowned. "Then we must consider an alternative. Either the blood was planted here, or it belongs to another victim altogether." Holmes gestured to the walls of the alley, where no bullet mark could be found. "A shot fired at point-blank range would have left its trace, if not on Eddington, then upon these bricks. Yet there is nothing, not even a ricochet." Watson exhaled sharply. "Are you suggesting the gunman fired a blank?" Holmes shook his head. "Number A shot was fired. Finch, the shooter, is adamant on that point. But the question remains, where did the bullet go?" Watson turned his gaze back to the blood, a deep unease settling in his chest. "And where did this come from?" Holmes straightened. "That, my dear Watson, is what we shall soon discover." A movement at the alley's entrance caught their attention. A constable, his uniform stiff with the evening damp, approached and tipped his hat. "The shooter is in custody, sir," he reported. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting for you at Scotland Yard." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then let us not keep him waiting." The interrogation room at Scotland Yard was a claustrophobic affair. Thick stone walls, dim gaslight, and the acrid scent of stale tobacco hanging in the air. Seated at the centre of it all was Thomas Finch, a career criminal whose usual bravado seemed to have abandoned him. His hands were clenched atop the table, his knuckles white. He had the look of a man who had seen a ghost. Lestrade, standing stiffly by the door, gestured toward the man. "There you have him, Mr. Holmes. The fellow swears up and down that he put a bullet into Eddington's heart. But as you and I both know, the man he supposedly killed is very much alive." Holmes moved closer, his sharp gaze studying Finch with the precision of a surgeon preparing an incision. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice almost conversational, "you have nothing to gain by lying to me, and everything to gain by telling me exactly what you saw." Finch swallowed. His eyes darted between them, his breath quickening. "I ain't lying," he whispered. "I shot him." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Describe it to me." Finch exhaled shakily. "He left the club alone. I waited in the alley. When he passed, I stepped out, gun in hand. He saw me, froze like a rabbit. I didn't give him time to run." He swallowed hard. "I fired, right in the chest." Watson's stomach tightened. "And what happened next?" Finch's fingers dug into the tabletop. He dropped, like a stone. He licked his lips, his face pale. "I swear to you he was dead. I saw the life go out of him." Holmes tilted his head. "And then?" Finch's breath hitched. "I ran. But then I looked back." Lestrade frowned. "And," Finch's voice dropped to a whisper, "he was standing, looking right at me." A heavy silence followed. Watson frowned. "Did you see the wound?" Finch nodded. "I saw the blood, but no hole, no injury, just blood, spreading across his shirt. His hands trembled. Then he smiled at me. Holmes's gaze darkened. "And that is why you ran." Finch shuddered. "I ain't afraid of many things, Mr. Holmes, but that wasn't natural." Holmes remained silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Lestrade. "I will need to speak to the bartender." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "The bartender? What for?" Holmes's lips curled faintly. "Because, Inspector, if a man truly returns from the dead, then I should very much like to hear what the last person to see him alive has to say." The gaslights flickered as Watson and Holmes walked in measured steps down the cobbled streets, the mystery weighing heavy between them. "I see but one possibility," Watson declared, his voice firm despite the gnawing doubt beneath. "Eddington must have staged his own death." Holmes said nothing. Watson pressed on, eager to unravel the puzzle. "Consider it, Holmes. If he wished to vanish, escape debts, a scandal, or some nameless threat, what better way than to feign his own murder? A willing accomplice fires a blank, he falls, the blood is prearranged. The illusion is perfect." Holmes finally looked at him, his gaze as sharp as steel beneath the brim of his hat. "And yet, Watson, your theory fails upon its first test." Watson frowned. "How so?" Holmes gestured toward the blood-stained cobblestones they had left behind in the alley. "If the shooting was staged, the accomplice must have fired a harmless round. And yet, our gunman is convinced beyond reason that he struck true." Watson opened his mouth, then hesitated. Holmes had a point. Finch's terror, the way his hands trembled as he spoke, was not the performance of a guilty man caught in a deception. It was something else, something deeper. Holmes adjusted his coat, the faintest smirk playing at his lips. "You assume, my dear Watson, that this trick, if trick it was performed for our benefit." "I am inclined to believe it was for his," Watson repeated. "Thomas Finch," Holmes mused, "the criminal who swears he saw a dead man rise. What better way to shatter the mind of a wanted man than to show him an impossibility?" A chill crawled down Watson's spine. He suddenly realized that he was not looking at the solution to a mystery. He was looking at its beginning. A sharp knock at the door of 221B Baker Street shattered the moment of silence that had settled between them. Watson opened it to find Inspector Lestrade, his usual air of irritation replaced by something graver. His face was pale beneath the flickering gaslight. "Holmes," he said briskly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You'll want to hear this." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then by all means, enlighten us, Inspector." Lestrade exhaled. A body's turned up, gunshot wound to the chest. Watson's stomach clenched. "Eddington?" Holmes asked, his voice unreadable. Lestrade hesitated. "Not quite." Holmes's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Lestrade tugged at his collar, clearly unsettled. "That's the trouble, Mr. Holmes. The body was found across the city. The time of death doesn't match, but, well..." He trailed off. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Out with it, Lestrade." Lestrade cleared his throat. "It's just that the dead man looks exactly like Eddington." A heavy silence fell upon the room. Holmes did not move for several long seconds. Then, slowly, he reached for his coat. "Watson," he murmured. Watson already had his medical bag in hand. "Right behind you." The morgue awaited. The air inside St. Bartholomew's morgue was thick with the scent of chemicals and cold stone. Watson had been inside its walls more times than he cared to count, but something about the silence of the dead never failed to unsettle him. The mortician led them to the farthest slab, where a sheet covered the corpse in question. Holmes moved first. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled the sheet down. Watson felt his breath hitch. The dead man before them was Eddington. Same sharp jawline, same greying hair at the temples, same thin scar upon the chin. But that was impossible. Holmes leaned in, his expression unreadable. He studied the face, its frozen, lifeless features, then turned to the hands, tracing the fingertips with the same keen precision of a man reading a book. Watson swallowed. Holmes, how is this possible? Holmes said nothing. His fingers moved to the corpse's collar, carefully unfastening the buttons. The blood-stained shirt parted to reveal a bullet wound. The skin around it was dark, the telltale sign of a shot fired at close range. There was no mistaking it. This man was truly dead. Watson shivered. Holmes, we spoke to Eddington barely a day ago. If he was truly killed elsewhere. He trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Holmes finally straightened, pulling the sheet back over the corpse. When he turned to Watson, his expression was dark. We are no longer investigating a mystery of survival, Watson, he said quietly. We are investigating a mystery of identity. The carriage ride back to Baker Street was silent, save for the distant echo of hoofbeats against stone. Watson sat across from Holmes, his thoughts tangled in impossibilities. Finally, he spoke. Holmes, if this man is Eddington, then who is the man who came to us? Holmes steepled his fingers. An excellent question, Watson. Watson ran a hand over his face. Could he be a twin? A double? Holmes' lips curled faintly. A possibility. But if so, it leads us to a far greater deception. Watson frowned. What do you mean? Holmes's gaze flickered with something dark. Tell me, Watson, what is the purpose of stealing a face? Watson stiffened. The weight of Holmes's words settled over him like ice. At that moment, the carriage slowed before 221B. Holmes stepped out first, his movements brisk. Watson followed, barely keeping pace as they ascended the stairs. Inside, Holmes wasted no time. He crossed to the hearth, where the fire burned low. His fingers closed over the edges of Eddington's discarded coat, still draped over the chair where he had left it the night before. He turned it over, studying the fabric beneath the gaslight. Then, quite suddenly, his hand stilled. Watson's pulse quickened. Holmes? Holmes traced the inside lining of the coat with the tip of his finger. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Watson, he said, this man is not merely dead. Holmes lifted his gaze, his eyes dark with certainty. He is our missing puzzle piece. Chapter 3. The Face in the Morgue. The air inside St. Bartholomew's morgue was thick with the sharp tang of formaldehyde, mingling with the cold sterility of polished stone. Watson had always felt a vague discomfort in such places. The silence, the stillness, the unyielding presence of the dead. But tonight, as he and Holmes stood over the sheet-covered slab, a far deeper unease settled in his chest. Holmes, ever composed, lifted the white shroud with a practiced hand. The gaslight flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. And there he was. The dead man beneath the sheet was Gerald Eddington. Watson stiffened, his pulse quickening despite himself. Same lean build, same aristocratic features, same neatly trimmed beard, flecked with premature grey. But that was impossible. Watson exhaled slowly. Holmes, we spoke to Eddington not 2 nights ago. Holmes said nothing. His sharp gaze flickered over the corpse's features, his expression impassive, unreadable. Lestrade, standing behind them with arms crossed, cleared his throat. A curious predicament, wouldn't you say? Watson tore his eyes from the corpse, shaking his head. Curious, he repeated. It's utterly confounding. Holmes ignored them both. His gloved fingers moved with meticulous care, tracing the contours of the dead man's face. He paused. Then, ever so slightly, his brow furrowed. Watson caught the shift. Holmes. Holmes didn't look up. This man, he murmured, has not merely died. His fingers moved again, almost reverently. He has been created. Watson leaned in, his medical instincts taking over. The rational mind demanded answers, but every glance at the corpse only deepened the questions. He pressed his fingers gently against the dead man's wrist, Cold. Too cold. The body had been dead for longer than they had been led to believe. Watson straightened. The resemblance is uncanny, he muttered. But there is no such thing as a perfect double. If this man were Eddington's twin, we would have known of it. Holmes nodded absently. Indeed, the records list no sibling, no estranged family member. And yet… Watson frowned. What is it? Holmes reached forward and, with a slow precision, pressed his thumb against the man's chin. A small scar, barely noticeable in the dim light, ran along the jawline, exactly where Eddington bore his own. The room felt colder. Watson whispered, "Holmes, what are you saying?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "I am saying, Watson, that this corpse has been altered." Lestrade let out a short laugh. "Altered? You mean to say someone went and carved the fellow up just to make him look like Eddington?" Holmes turned to him with unsettling calm. "Precisely." Watson felt his stomach tighten. But why? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, studying the body in silence, his mind racing through possibilities. Then quietly he said, "Because someone needed him to be found." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Right, well, that's damned unsettling. I'll give you that. But here's something more." He withdrew a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. "I had my men dig into Eddington's affairs. Turns out he made a rather substantial withdrawal from his accounts 3 days before his supposed death." Holmes unfolded the paper, his gaze scanning the sum. Watson leaned in. £50,000, he murmured. "Good Lord, that's a fortune." Lestrade nodded. "Enough to disappear, wouldn't you say?" Holmes turned to him. "And yet, rather than disappearing, he reappears in our sitting room, claiming to have survived an impossible shooting. Tell me, Inspector, does that strike you as logical?" Lestrade frowned. "You're saying he didn't take the money to flee?" Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am saying," he said, "that he did not take it for himself." Watson straightened. "Then for whom?" Holmes flicked the paper between his fingers, deep in thought. "That," he said, "is the next question we must answer." He turned back to the corpse, his mind already piecing together a picture that was, as yet, only half formed. Eddington had bought something, or someone, and whatever that transaction had entailed, it had been enough to lead to 2 dead men bearing the same face. Holmes crossed the room in swift, decisive strides, approaching the morgue's ledger. He flipped through its pages, eyes scanning the records of the dead. Watson and Lestrade exchanged a glance before moving to his side. "What are you looking for?" Watson asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, he tapped the page before him. "This." Watson leaned in. The entry was dated 3 weeks prior, listing the death of an unknown man, approximate age matching Eddington's. The cause of death: unspecified medical complications. The attending physician: Dr. Elias Wakefield. Lestrade scoffed. "Wakefield? I know the name. Unorthodox fellow, was dismissed from St. Thomas's Hospital some years ago for experimental practices." Holmes nodded. "A man of talent, but not of ethics. He vanished from the public eye shortly after his expulsion. If he has resurfaced, it is not as a respectable doctor." Watson's grip tightened around the edge of the ledger. "Holmes, are you saying this man was altered before he was even dead?" Holmes met his gaze. "I am saying, Watson, that Wakefield has spent years reshaping men into others." Lestrade let out a slow breath. "You mean to tell me someone paid this doctor to carve up a corpse to resemble Eddington?" Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Not a corpse, Inspector." A heavy silence followed. Lestrade stiffened. "You mean to say…" Holmes closed the ledger with a soft thud. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I mean to say that whoever this man once was, He did not go willingly into death. Watson swallowed hard. There was no greater crime than stealing a man's life, except perhaps for stealing his very identity. The cab rattled through the damp streets of London, its wheels cutting through the mist that curled along the pavement like ghostly tendrils. Inside, Holmes sat motionless, his steepled fingers pressed against his lips, his sharp eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Watson, seated across from him, shifted uneasily. He had seen Holmes in such a state before, his mind racing through the labyrinth of deduction faster than words could keep pace. At last, Watson spoke. "You have formed a theory." Holmes did not stir. "I have formed the beginnings of one," he murmured. Watson exhaled. "And what, pray, do you suspect?" Holmes lowered his hands and turned to him. "Consider what we know. Gerald Eddington was declared dead, yet he walked into our sitting room unharmed. Now, we find a corpse bearing his exact likeness, with the telltale signs of surgical alteration. Eddington himself withdrew a considerable sum of money before his supposed demise. And finally, the name of a disgraced physician emerges from the shadows, one with a history of reshaping identities." Watson frowned. "You believe this Wakefield fellow was offering his services to the desperate?" Holmes gave a tight smile. "More than that, Watson. I believe we have stumbled upon a trade in new lives." Watson stiffened. "New lives?" Holmes nodded. "A clandestine network, a society that erases men, transforms them into someone else at a price. Criminals, debtors, men fleeing scandal. What better way to escape the gallows than to abandon one's own face?" Watson's blood ran cold. "And what of the corpse in the morgue?" Holmes's expression darkened. "I fear he was the unwilling cost of such a transaction." The cab slowed, jerking slightly as it came to a halt. Holmes straightened his coat. "We shall find our answers soon enough, Watson." He stepped out onto the fog-laden street. The brass plate beside the darkened doorway read, "Elias Wakefield, M.D." But the building before them was silent as a tomb. The door creaked under Holmes's touch, swinging inward with a reluctant groan. The room beyond was dark. Too dark. Watson's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his side. "Holmes," he murmured. Holmes raised a gloved hand for silence, stepping forward. The scent of something acrid hung in the air, not quite smoke, not quite decay. They moved deeper into the office. The examination table was overturned, papers strewn across the floor in haphazard disarray. A shelf had been torn from the wall, its glass vials shattered upon the wooden planks. Someone had been here before them. Holmes moved swiftly, his keen eyes darting over the wreckage. "Not a robbery," he muttered. "No valuables taken, no safe forced open. This was not about theft. It was about erasure." Watson's gaze fell to the desk. A fine layer of soot marred its surface. "The fireplace," he murmured. "Someone tried to burn something here." Holmes turned sharply. "Then we must see what they failed to destroy." He strode to the hearth, crouching before the smouldering embers. Watson stood behind him, tension curling through his spine. Holmes reached into the ashes, his fingers moving with delicate precision. And then, suddenly, he stopped. For there, half consumed by flame, was a single charred letter. Holmes extracted the brittle sheet of parchment with exquisite care, lifting it into the dim light. Watson could make out only fragments of ink, the rest swallowed by fire. Holmes's gaze sharpened as he read aloud the remnants. "The transaction is complete. Preparations for the second phase. The substitute will." He turned the paper, scanning the margins, when suddenly his grip tightened. Watson caught a glimpse of a single word at the bottom of the letter, burned at the edges, yet still visible. Eddington. A silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of revelation. Watson exhaled. So it was arranged. The corpse was never meant to be Eddington. It was a substitute. Holmes nodded slowly. A man plucked from obscurity, altered, and sacrificed, so that the true Eddington might vanish beyond reach. Watson swallowed hard. And if Eddington has truly disappeared? Holmes's eyes glowed with something dark. Then we must ask, Watson, who is living in his place? The fire crackled softly as Holmes lowered the scorched letter to the table. His fingers tapped against the wood, his mind spinning threads into patterns. Watson sat back, rubbing a hand across his face. Holmes, this scheme, this entire affair, it is beyond anything we have encountered before. Holmes leaned forward. And yet, Watson, consider its elegance. Watson frowned. Elegance. Holmes steepled his fingers. Imagine a man of means, one with debts, scandals, or enemies circling ever closer. Such a man cannot simply disappear, for his name, his face, his legacy tie him to the world. Watson listened in silence. Holmes continued, but what if he could trade his existence for another? What if he could purchase a new face, a new name, a new past, while another poor soul was altered to take his place in death? Watson exhaled slowly. Then the true Eddington is still out there. Holmes nodded. Walking free. Reborn. The room seemed colder despite the fire. Watson stared into the flames, watching as the embers shifted, swallowing the last fragments of the letter. Then Holmes spoke again. His voice was quiet, measured, and carrying with it the full weight of realization. The answer, Watson, he murmured, was never in the bullet, but in the man himself. And with that, the mystery twisted into something far darker than either of them had imagined. Chapter 4. The Dead Man Speaks. The dim gaslight flickered as Watson leaned over the corpse, his fingers ghosting across the cold, lifeless skin. The faint scent of formaldehyde lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp bite of antiseptic, a scent he had come to associate with death. The man on the slab was a mirror image of Gerald Eddington. Same angular jaw, same neatly trimmed beard, same high cheekbones. Yet something about him felt artificial, a forgery so masterful that it could deceive the untrained eye. Watson exhaled and adjusted his lamplight. Something is not right, Holmes, he murmured, his fingers brushing along the man's hairline. The skin here. He paused. Holmes, standing in the shadows with arms folded, inclined his head. What of it, Watson? Watson pressed a finger gently against the flesh just behind the ear and traced downward. There, beneath the thin growth of stubble, his fingertips met something unnatural, a fine ridge of raised skin. His stomach tightened. He reached into his medical bag, withdrawing a scalpel. With a surgeon's precision, he made a shallow incision along the seam. And then, in the dim light of the morgue, the truth revealed itself. The skin peeled away. Not flesh, but something altered, manipulated. Beneath it, the muscle and bone structure appeared unnaturally smooth, as though reshaped by a masterful hand. Watson looked up sharply. Holmes, these are surgical alterations. A long silence followed. Then Holmes murmured, So, the good Dr. Wakefield's work is not merely a rumour, it is a reality. Holmes stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He regarded the body with something akin to fascination, his gaze moving swiftly from the incised hairline to the contours of the face. This was no crude disguise, he said quietly. This was carefully engineered deception. Watson wiped his scalpel and straightened. Whoever performed this surgery was meticulous. The scars were deliberately concealed, the alterations so finely done that even I might have overlooked them without closer inspection. Holmes nodded. Then we must ask ourselves the question, why would a man undergo such a transformation? And more importantly, he gestured toward the corpse, why would he be discarded once the deception was complete? Watson exhaled, his mind turning over the implications. Holmes, this man, he was shaped to resemble Eddington. Holmes's lips curled faintly. Indeed, which tells us two things. First, that the real Eddington has vanished, and second, that someone else has taken his place. Watson felt a slow, creeping dread settle over him. Holmes, do you mean to suggest that the man we met, the one who claimed to have survived the shooting, was not Eddington at all? Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Precisely, Watson. The fire crackled low in the hearth of 221B Baker Street as Holmes paced before it, his movements quick, precise, a mind assembling a puzzle with invisible pieces. Watson sat in his chair, watching his friend with growing unease. Holmes, this is a deception on an extraordinary scale. The implications are vast, Watson, Holmes interjected. He turned sharply. Consider the skill required, not merely in the physical alteration, but in the performance. A man must not only look the part but live it. The impostor knew Eddington's habits, his manner of speech, his past, which means this is no mere act of forgery. It is something greater. Watson swallowed. And the real Eddington? Holmes's expression darkened. Missing, or worse. Watson exhaled slowly. But why go to such lengths? Why create a double at all? Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed upon Watson. What is the ultimate purpose of an impostor, Watson? Watson frowned. To replace the original. Holmes nodded. Indeed. And if that is the case, then the man posing as Eddington at 221B was not merely assuming his identity. Watson's breath caught. He was ensuring that no one would look for the real one. Holmes tapped his fingers together. Exactly. A weight settled over the room, the gravity of the revelation thick between them. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his voice quiet but edged with steel. There is only one way to confirm my suspicions, Watson. Watson looked up, already knowing what was coming. And that is? Holmes's smile was sharp. We set a trap. Holmes rose and strode to his writing desk, his movements brisk, efficient. He retrieved a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen into the inkwell. We must think as our adversary does, he murmured, scrawling a note with swift, deliberate strokes. Whoever orchestrated this deception will not simply vanish. They have a purpose, an objective. And for a deception of this scale, there is only one kind of clientele. Watson leaned forward. Criminals? Holmes's lips twitched. Of a very specific kind. He turned the note toward Watson. To Dr. Elias Wakefield. I seek not escape, but rebirth. A sum will be arranged. Meet me, and we shall discuss the price of a new life. A prospective client. Watson frowned. And who, precisely, will be posing as this prospective client? Holmes smiled. Why, you, of course. Watson stiffened. Holmes, Holmes raised a hand. Watson, you are a military man. You have seen war, deception, and death. You are the very image of a man seeking a way out. Watson inhaled sharply. And if Wakefield suspects deception? Holmes's smile did not reach his eyes. Then I shall be close enough to ensure that he does not act upon it. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. Watson looked at the note again, feeling the weight of the scheme settling onto his shoulders. Very well, Holmes, he murmured. Let us see what price a man must pay to become someone else. The heavy fog of London clung to Watson's coat as he stepped from the cab, his breath curling in the cold air. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the raw tension of the moment. He had assumed many roles during his time alongside Sherlock Holmes, soldier, doctor, chronicler, but never before had he been asked to sell a lie to a den of criminals. The note Holmes had prepared lay folded in his breast pocket. A single phrase had been scrawled on the back in Holmes's precise hand. Confidence is your greatest ally. Hesitation is your doom. Watson exhaled, straightened his spine, and stepped forward. The meeting place was unremarkable, a small tobacconist's shop on a quiet street near the Thames. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the scent of strong tobacco filled his nostrils. Behind the counter stood a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes, his fingers idly tapping against the wood. He barely glanced at Watson before nodding toward a curtained doorway at the back of the shop. Watson stepped through. A single chair sat in the dimly lit back room, facing a man in a velvet waistcoat, his expression one of polite interest. "You are seeking a new life," the man said smoothly, his fingers tapping against a pocket watch. "A man does not come to us unless he is desperate or dangerous. Which are you?" Watson kept his expression neutral. "Desperate enough to pay," he said evenly. The man smiled thinly. "Good. Then let us discuss the price of your rebirth." Watson had expected secrecy, but nothing could have prepared him for the world that lay beneath London's surface. The man in the velvet waistcoat led him through a series of winding alleyways before stopping at a nondescript door. He knocked once, twice, then 3 times in quick succession. A bolt slid back, and the door opened. Watson stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and decay. Dim lanterns flickered, casting long shadows against the brick walls. A surgical table stood in the center of the room, its surface stained from past procedures. Cabinets lined the walls, filled with scalpels, bandages, and surgical notes scrawled in untidy script. Men sat in corners, their faces wrapped in bandages, their postures hunched in quiet anticipation. Each was waiting to be made into someone else. A low murmur of conversation filled the space, but Watson caught snippets of it. His nose must be altered further. The cheekbones are still too sharp. We must ensure the scars remain hidden beneath the hairline. The full horror of it settled in his chest. This was not merely a place where men escaped their pasts. It was a place where identities were stolen and rewritten, where one man's disappearance became another man's rebirth. And somewhere within this practice, Watson knew, the truth about Eddington awaited. Watson moved carefully, his every step measured, his every glance discreet. He could not afford to reveal himself too soon. Then, a voice, soft but edged with quiet menace, cut through the murmur of the room like a blade. "You should not have come here." Watson turned sharply. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, his face half lit by the lantern's glow. He was immaculately dressed, a man who commanded authority even in a place so riddled with secrecy. Holmes, standing at the far end of the room, remained impassive. The man's gaze flickered between them. "We warned you once, Mr. Holmes. Yet here you are, meddling where you do not belong." Holmes smiled faintly. Curiosity is a difficult habit to break. The man exhaled slowly. "I have found that bullets cure many habits." From the folds of his coat, a pistol gleamed in the dim light. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. The pistol's barrel gleamed as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, a single gunshot shattered the quiet. Watson flinched. The man staggered backward, his weapon clattering to the floor. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. From the doorway, Lestrade stepped forward, his revolver still smoking. "I believe the game is up, gentlemen." Holmes exhaled, turning to Watson, his lips curled ever so slightly. "Now, Watson," he murmured, "is our moment." Chapter 5. The confrontation at the docks. The air was thick with the brine of the Thames, the scent mingling with the stench of tar and rotting wood. The distant clang of chains echoed through the fog-choked docks, the sound swallowed by the black abyss of the water below. Watson's boots scraped against the damp planks as he stumbled forward, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Beside him, Holmes walked with measured steps, his breathing steady, despite their dire predicament. 2 men flanked them, hulking figures, their grips like iron shackles. Watson could feel the bruises forming beneath his skin from their earlier struggle, but it was not pain that gnawed at him. It was the silence of Holmes. His friend, usually so quick to defy danger with sharp wit and sharper deductions, had said nothing since they had been seized. That was more troubling than the ropes around his wrists. They were led past towering crates, their shadows looming like gravestones in the mist. Lanterns swung overhead, casting ghostly light upon the murky water. Then, suddenly, they stopped. A single figure stood at the edge of the dock, half shrouded in fog, the glow of a gold-tipped cigarette the only thing visible. A voice, smooth, cultured, and laced with venom, cut through the night. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you've proven yourself to be quite the nuisance." The figure took a step forward, and the lanterns caught his face. Watson inhaled sharply. The man before them was Charles Blackwood, a financier of ill repute, a man who had been whispered about in certain circles but never formally accused of any crime. Holmes exhaled, almost bored. "Blackwood," he mused. "I had rather hoped for someone with a touch more imagination." Blackwood smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who held absolute control. "And yet, Mr. Holmes, here you are, tied, beaten, and at my mercy." He took another drag from his cigarette, the embers glowing red. "For a man so insufferably clever, you do find yourself in quite a number of hopeless situations." Watson felt a surge of rage. "You murdered Eddington. You stole his life and left another man to die in his place." Blackwood tilted his head, amused. "Doctor, you wound me. Murder is such a crude word. I merely facilitated a necessary transition." Holmes remained still, his gaze piercing. "You orchestrated a deception so intricate that even Scotland Yard might have been fooled. A vanishing act in plain sight. One man erased, another sculpted into his likeness." Blackwood smirked. "A clever trick, wouldn't you say?" Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Clever, yes. Flawless." Number Blackwood stiffened. Holmes tilted his head, eyes gleaming. "And therein lies your mistake." Holmes took a step forward, his bound hands forgotten, his voice carrying through the fog like a razor's edge. "You underestimated the human element." Blackwood said nothing, but his jaw tensed ever so slightly. Holmes continued, his tone sharp, deliberate. "You see, I first suspected the truth when I examined the corpse in the morgue. The surgical alterations were precise, but there were small imperfections, details no surgeon could replicate. The set of the hands, the weight of the gait, the timbre of the voice, the subtleties of a man's existence cannot be manufactured." Watson felt his breath quicken. Holmes went on. "Eddington was a man of particular habits. His right hand bore the calluses of a lifelong fencer, yet the man who came to Baker Street had a grip as soft as an idle aristocrat's. The impostor did not live his role. He performed it." Blackwood exhaled a slow, measured breath. "Fascinating," he murmured. "And yet knowing this did not stop you from walking into my hands." Holmes smiled. "Ah," he said softly. "But that was my intention all along." Blackwood's brow furrowed. Holmes's voice dropped, like a dagger slipping between ribs. "You see, Blackwood, I never walk into a trap unless I know how to spring it from within." And then, a whistle cut through the night. From the shadows of the dockyard, figures emerged. Policemen, weapons drawn, their coats flashing in the lantern light. Lestrade's voice rang out. "Drop the gun, Blackwood!" And in that moment, the entire tide turned. Blackwood reacted instantly. In one swift motion, he drew a pistol, leveling it at Holmes's heart. Watson's stomach lurched. For a single, terrible second, time seemed to freeze. The cold metal glinting under the lantern's glow, Blackwood's finger curling over the trigger. Holmes did not move. The smirk never left his lips. Watson struggled against his bindings, desperation rising in his chest. Then, a single gunshot rang out. Blackwood staggered backward, his weapon slipping from his fingers. He let out a strangled gasp, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had torn through fabric and flesh. Lestrade stood behind him, revolver smoking. Holmes exhaled and turned to Watson. "Now, my dear Watson," he murmured, "shall we conclude this farce?" And as Blackwood fell to his knees, The fog rolling in from the Thames swallowed the night whole. A hush fell over the dockside. Blackwood, the architect of this deception, stood poised, his pistol gleaming in the lantern's dim glow. His eyes, calculating, merciless, remained fixed upon Holmes, the weight of inevitability settling upon the scene. Watson, bound and powerless, could only watch as his friend faced the spectre of death with his usual infuriating calm. Holmes exhaled, his voice smooth, even casual. "Tell me, Blackwood, do you play chess?" Blackwood smirked. "A game of strategy, sacrifice, and inevitability?" "Of course." Holmes nodded slightly. "Then you will understand that while you may believe you hold the king in check, you have failed to notice the knight." With a flick of his wrist, the glint of steel caught the lantern light, a concealed blade, drawn in a motion so fluid, so swift, that even Watson barely registered it. In an instant, the ropes that bound Holmes fell away. A single movement, a complete reversal. The trap had never been Blackwood's to spring. The villain took a step back, his composure faltering, the gun trembling ever so slightly in his grasp. Holmes smiled. Checkmate. Then, chaos erupted. Blackwood bolted into the mist, his coat billowing behind him, as he vanished into the labyrinthine docks. "Watson, with me," Holmes called, already in pursuit. The fog was thick, curling like ghostly fingers around the wooden crates and barrels lining the pier. The clatter of footsteps on wet planks reverberated through the night as Blackwood ran, weaving between shadowed alleyways, his breath ragged. Behind him, Holmes moved like a spectre, his footfalls nearly silent, his coat a dark silhouette against the lantern-lit mist. Watson followed, his heart hammering, his revolver clenched in his grip. Somewhere ahead, Blackwood's boots thudded against the planks, each step more desperate than the last. A shouted command rang out in the distance. Lestrade's men had spread out, cutting off possible escape routes. Trapped, and Blackwood knew it. The sound of his breath, ragged and frantic, reached Holmes's ears as they gained ground. Then, a sharp turn, a moment of hesitation. And Holmes struck. With a final lunge, he tackled Blackwood, sending them both crashing against the dockside railing. The Thames loomed black below, the water churning, restless. Blackwood struggled, a cornered beast, but Holmes's grip was iron. "It's over," Holmes murmured. But Blackwood was not done yet. Blackwood's hand darted toward the pistol tucked within his coat. Watson saw the movement, too fast, too sudden, and raised his own weapon. A single gunshot cracked through the night. The mist swallowed the sound, but the outcome was clear. Blackwood staggered, his fingers failing to close around his pistol, his breath escaping in a sharp, ragged gasp. For a moment, he remained upright, swaying like a man on the edge of waking from a terrible dream. Then, he collapsed. The docks fell silent once more. Holmes straightened, brushing the damp from his coat, his expression unreadable. Watson lowered his revolver, the echoes of the shot still ringing in his ears. The chase was over. And yet, Holmes's gaze remained distant, as if seeing something beyond the mist, beyond the night itself. Holmes stood over Blackwood's still form, the villain's breath shallow, his strength spent. The man who had orchestrated an elaborate deception, who had stolen a life and tried to erase his own, now lay upon the very docks where his scheme had begun. Watson exhaled, stepping closer. "It's finished, Holmes." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he knelt beside Blackwood, studying the man with the detached curiosity of a scholar examining a specimen beneath glass. Then softly, so softly that Watson almost did not hear, he spoke. "A man can escape many things, my dear Watson, but his own past will always catch up." Blackwood let out a faint, bitter chuckle, a sound not of regret, but of understanding. The distant whistle of a police carriage approached. Holmes rose, adjusting his cuffs with a quiet finality. Watson watched him, knowing that, though the case had reached its conclusion, Holmes's mind was already moving forward, toward the next puzzle, the next enigma, the next unseen thread in the fabric of mystery. The fog closed in around them, swallowing the past, the present, and the secrets that would forever drift upon the waters of the Thames. Chapter 6. The Haunting Truth. The steady rhythm of the rain against the docks had ceased, leaving behind only the distant murmur of the Thames lapping against the wooden pilings. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the pallid face of the man now slumped against the damp planks. Charles Blackwood, once a name whispered in drawing rooms and financial circles, now lay exposed before the scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes. The struggle was over. The chase had ended. Yet there was something in Blackwood's expression, not fear, not regret, but a quiet resignation. Holmes adjusted his cuffs, his voice cutting through the silence like the edge of a blade. "I had wondered how long you could outrun your own reflection, Blackwood," he murmured. Blackwood exhaled a quiet laugh, blood staining his sleeve where Lestrade's bullet had torn through. "It was a rather exquisite illusion, wasn't it?" Holmes tilted his head, studying the man with that familiar, piercing gaze. An illusion, certainly, but one always destined to collapse under the weight of its own deception. Watson stepped forward, his mind still grappling with the full implications. "You faked your own death to escape financial ruin," he said, more to himself than to Blackwood. "You knew the creditors were closing in. That scandal would soon follow. So, you found a man who could be shaped into you, one who would die in your place." Blackwood's lips curled faintly. And it would have worked, if not for him. His gaze flickered toward Holmes. Holmes smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Yes," he murmured. "I do have a habit of interrupting such theatrics." Holmes began to pace, the air still charged with the remnants of the deception that had unfolded. "You could not simply disappear," he said, his voice steady, methodical. "That would have been too crude, too suspicious. No, you needed something far more elaborate, a perfect exchange." Watson listened, his mind reconstructing the puzzle along with Holmes's words. "You found your mirror, a man similar enough in stature, in build, a man who, with just the right touch, surgical precision, careful manipulation, could become you." Blackwood chuckled, shaking his head. "The brilliance was not in the act itself, but in the misdirection. A performance, if you will." Holmes nodded. "A performance indeed. You orchestrated a crime where you were the victim, shot at close range, collapsed in a public place. Witnesses saw you die. It was flawless." Blackwood's expression remained composed, but something flickered in his gaze. Holmes continued, relentless. "And yet there was one variable you did not anticipate." He turned to Watson. "Memory." Watson frowned. "Memory?" Holmes nodded. "Even a perfectly crafted deception cannot erase the truth embedded in a man's movements, his speech, his habits. Your imposter, Blackwood, he was convincing, but not perfect. A single gesture, an incorrect turn of phrase, a hesitation where there should have been certainty, and the illusion wavered." Blackwood sighed, tilting his head back against the wooden railing. "You see ghosts where there are none, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's lips twitched. "And yet, here you are, bound and bleeding, your masquerade undone." As the constables hauled Blackwood to his feet, Watson felt an inexplicable weight settle upon him. It was not triumph he felt, nor even relief. It was something far more troubling. Holmes had unmasked the deception with the precision of a surgeon, had restored order to a world momentarily unmoored. And yet, as Watson watched the defeated figure being led toward the waiting carriage, he could not shake the question gnawing at his mind. "What if?" he said softly. He had been better at it. Holmes, who had been adjusting his coat, turned to him with mild curiosity. Watson hesitated. What if Blackwood had played his role without flaw? What if he had mimicked every habit, every inflection, every memory? Could he have simply become Eddington, lived as him, died as him, with no one ever the wiser? Holmes studied Watson for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled softly. "The most convincing falsehoods, Watson, are not built from lies," he murmured. "They are built from fragments of the truth." Watson frowned. "But if a lie is believed long enough, lived long enough, does it not, in some way, become real?" Holmes said nothing at first. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Perhaps the most unsettling question, my dear Watson, is not whether a man can become his own fiction." His gaze lingered on the retreating figure of Blackwood, but how often he already has. A chill crept up Watson's spine, though he could not say why. The fire in 221B crackled softly, the only sound filling the pensive silence between them. The city outside moved on, unaware of the deception unravelled, the truth restored. Watson sat in his chair, a glass of brandy in his hand, but he had scarcely taken a sip. His thoughts were still tangled in the night's events, in the man who had almost disappeared completely, yet still existed in fragments. Across from him, Holmes sat in his usual posture, legs stretched, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. At last, Watson spoke. "It is done, then?" Holmes exhaled through his nose. "Yes, I suppose it is." Watson frowned. "You do not sound satisfied." Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the fire, the golden glow flickering against his sharp features. "At what point, Watson," he murmured, "does a man cease to be the person he once was? When he alters his face, his name, or is it when he simply chooses to forget?" Watson shifted uncomfortably. "The man was a criminal, Holmes." Holmes's lips curved slightly. "And yet, had he succeeded, he would not have been." Watson exhaled. "A terrifying thought." Holmes tilted his head. "Terrifying, yes, but it is not the criminals who should concern us the most, Watson." He turned his gaze to his friend, eyes sharp with meaning. "It is the ones who were never caught." Watson swallowed, feeling the weight of the words settle in his chest. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of London. The city, vast and unknowing, swallowed the remnants of the night's secrets, leaving only the embers of a haunting truth behind. The damp night air had lost its bite, but the weight of the case still lingered like a spectre. The docks had emptied, the constables had taken Blackwood away, and yet Holmes remained where he stood, his sharp gaze fixed on something unseen, something unresolved. Watson watched him carefully, knowing the restless energy in his friend meant that one last piece of the puzzle remained unexamined. Holmes knelt beside the discarded coat of their fallen adversary and reached into the inner pocket. His fingers withdrew a crumpled letter, its edges yellowed with age, the creases deep from years of careful folding and unfolding. Watson stepped closer as Holmes smoothed the parchment upon a nearby crate. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible. "My dearest C, we cannot go on like this. The truth will find us, no matter how carefully we bury it. If you wish to live as another man, you must be prepared to let the past die completely. I cannot follow you down this road. But know this, you are not the only one who wears your face." E. A silence settled between them. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against the paper, his expression unreadable. "Fascinating." Watson frowned. "A final confession?" Holmes lifted the letter between two fingers, his gaze narrowing. A warning. Then, a smaller slip of paper tumbled from the folds of the letter, landing between them. Not a letter. A photograph. And in that moment, the entire case shifted into something far more unsettling. The photograph was aged, its edges curled, the image within captured in the faint sepia hues of an era long past. Watson lifted it gently, his fingers running along its brittle surface. His eyes focused on the man in the picture. His breath caught. It was Blackwood. Or at least, it should have been. But the photo was too old. The clothes, the style, the background. It was a portrait taken decades ago. Watson felt his pulse quicken. "Holmes, this can't be possible." Holmes tilted his head slightly. watching Watson's reaction with a bemused expression. And why not? Watson swallowed. Because this man, this Blackwood, should not exist in this time. Holmes took the photograph, studying it under the dim light of the gas lamps. And yet, here he is, unaged, unchanged. Watson struggled for an explanation, his rational mind battling the creeping unease curling in his stomach. A relative, then. A father, perhaps. Holmes smirked. A convenient assumption. But what if I told you, Watson, that no record exists of any Blackwood before the one we apprehended tonight? Watson's mouth felt dry. That's absurd. Every man has a past. Holmes twirled the photograph between his fingers. Precisely. A past that did not exist. The implications sent a shudder through Watson. There had been deception, of course, identities stolen, lives erased. But this was something else entirely, something that should not be possible. Holmes turned the photograph in his fingers once more, before setting it carefully atop the letter. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with something close to amusement. He leaned back against the wooden railing of the dock, the fog rolling in around them once more, thick and inescapable. Then, softly, almost as if speaking to himself, he said, "Tell me, Watson, do you think a man can truly kill himself twice?" The question hung in the night air, heavy, unspoken. Watson did not answer. He could not. The rational explanation was simple. A resemblance, a carefully orchestrated lie, a fraud carried across generations. And yet, as he stared at the old photograph, at the man who should not be there, a whisper of doubt settled in his bones. A whisper that told him, perhaps for the first time in his life, that not all things could be explained. Holmes turned, his coat billowing as he stepped away from the dock. "Come, Watson," he murmured. "The night grows colder, and I believe we have exhausted this mystery's explanations." And though Watson followed, the unease never left him. Because as much as he wished to dismiss the thought, as much as he wished to deny the possibility, there was still a man out there wearing Blackwood's face, and they had no way of knowing where or when they would see him again.